The glass doors of the ballroom swung open with the quiet push of a gloved hand. The music did not falter, the chandeliers did not dim, but something shifted like the faint change in air before a storm. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Silverware hovered in mid-air. The man in the black tuxedo, halfway through a toast, lost his words. Because at the threshold stood someone who did not belong. Elena Rivera. She was not on the guest list. She had not been invited. She had never seen a room like this from the inside, its gold leaf walls, its mirrored ceilings, its people moving as if they owned not only this hall, but the world beyond it. She should have been invisible here, as she was in most places. And yet, in this moment, every gaze was fixed on her. In her hand, a simple cream envelope. Unmarked, except for the faint crest pressed into the paper, an old family seal, so old that only a few in the room would recognize it. Those who did felt their faces tighten, their posture stiffen. Elena walked forward, her shoes whispering against marble. She did not lower her eyes. She did not rush. She was used to being underestimated. Tonight, that was her weapon. At the far end of the room stood Victor Beaumont, patriarch of the Beaumont family empire. His name was on skyscrapers, newspapers, foundations. To Elena, his face had been only an image on magazine covers, always smiling, always untouchable. Now, in person, the man's presence filled the air like the scent of expensive cigars, thick, suffocating, inescapable. The music died completely. "I believe this belongs to you," Elena said, her voice calm but carrying through the hall. She placed the envelope on the crystal-laden table in front of him. He didn't reach for it. His eyes scanned her face, then her clothes simple, neat, nothing that could be mistaken for wealth. He seemed to search for an explanation, for someone to step forward and claim she was lost, mistaken, perhaps intoxicated. But Elena stayed. The envelope stayed, and so did the silence. When Victor finally opened it, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Inside, there was no letter, only a photograph, slightly faded, of a young woman holding a baby. The woman's eyes were unmistakable. They were Victor's eyes, and the child in her arms carried the exact shape of his jaw. The photograph was dated 27 years ago. A murmur began, like the rustle of leaves before wind. Heads turned between Elena and Victor. Someone whispered the word scandal with the fascination of a prayer. Victor closed the envelope with deliberate slowness. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My mother kept it," Elena replied, "along with the others, the letters." The will. It was the first crack in his composure. His eyes narrowed, not in denial, but in calculation. The kind a man makes when the truth he has buried threatens to surface before the wrong audience. Elena felt every heartbeat echo in her ears, but her voice did not tremble. "I came tonight because I'm done being a secret. I am your daughter, and I have proof." The weight of her words did not fall evenly. Some faces hardened with disdain, others softened with unease. A few guests glanced toward Victor's wife, seated at the head table in a gown the color of cold steel. Her expression was unreadable, except for the faint tension around her mouth. Elena had imagined this moment for years. In her daydreams, it was full of shouting, accusations, chaos. But here, in this glittering prison of wealth, the fight was quieter, sharper. It was the battle of presence, her standing there, refusing to vanish, against decades of a story told without her. Victor's voice was low. "You have no idea what you're doing." She met his gaze. "On the contrary, I know exactly what I'm doing." In her bag were the documents, her mother's letters, kept neatly despite the years. A notarized copy of a will that bore Victor Beaumont's signature, leaving a trust in the name of "my child, Elena, born to Sofia Rivera." There were even birth records that had been discreetly altered, then restored by a stubborn legal clerk who believed in keeping things correct. Proof irrefutable. She had not come to demand money. She had not come for vengeance. She had come to dismantle the fiction that had defined her life, the fiction that she was no one from nowhere. Victor leaned back in his chair. Around him, the hall waited for his verdict. His denial, his outrage, his dismissal. But he did not speak. Instead, it was his sister, Margaret, who rose from her seat. Tall, silver-haired, and sharp as cut glass, she approached Elena with the air of someone approaching a stray animal curious, but ready to strike. "Your mother," Margaret began, her voice smooth, "was complicated." "She was honest," Elena interrupted. The older woman's brows arched. Honesty is often a matter of perspective. "And hiding a child?" Elena asked. "Is that perspective too?" A few guests looked away. Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she did not answer. She returned to her seat, leaving the question to hang, heavy and unanswered. Victor's hand rested on the envelope. His knuckles were pale. Finally, he spoke not to Elena, but to the room. "Enjoy your evening," he said, each word deliberate. "This conversation is over." He rose, signaling an end, but Elena did not move. "Not until the truth is acknowledged," she said. "Not until you admit who I am." It was bold, too bold for this world of measured words and guarded glances. A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. Victor's gaze turned cold. "Leave," he said. But Elena did not step back. "Do you want me to read the will here?" she asked softly. "Or show them the photographs? I'll do it. I'm not afraid anymore." Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years spent in silence, of a life lived on the edges of someone else's story. And in that moment, she saw it, the flicker in his eyes. Not fear of her, but fear of what would happen if the others believed her. The chandelier light caught the edge of the photograph, still half visible in the open envelope. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "She looks just like him." And for the first time that night, Victor looked away. The silence did not break, but it deepened thicker, heavier, until it felt like the air itself resisted breathing. Elena could hear her own pulse, steady but insistent, as if urging her to hold her ground. She had not crossed the city in a borrowed dress and worn shoes to retreat now. Victor adjusted his cufflinks with the measured precision of a man reclaiming control. He would not give her the satisfaction of a public scene, but his eyes told a different story, one of careful assessment, as though she were a problem to be contained. "Elena," he said at last, tasting her name as if it were foreign, "this is neither the time nor the place." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "It's the only time and the only place you'd have to listen." Gasps fluttered at the edges of the crowd. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between her and the patriarch they had come to celebrate. This evening was supposed to be a commemoration 40 years since the founding of Beaumont International. The speeches were meant to praise the man who had built an empire with his bare hands. Elena knew better. "My mother," she began, her voice steady but low, forcing them all to lean in, "was there when you were still borrowing offices you couldn't afford. She was there when you had nothing but debts and promises. And she believed you?" Margaret let out a soft, disdainful laugh. "And now you think a few old letters give you a seat at this table?" Elena's gaze turned toward her. "No, the truth gives me that, whether you like it or not." She could feel the heat rising from whispers around her. They wanted her to break, to falter, to look small in a room designed to make people like her feel exactly that. But she had learned long ago that dignity was not something you waited to be given. It was something you refused to surrender. Victor's wife finally spoke. Her voice was clear, composed, but it held an edge honed over years of guarding the fortress of their family name. "What is it you want, Miss Rivera?" Elena met her gaze without blinking. I want the truth acknowledged, publicly. A brittle silence followed. You realize what that would mean? The woman asked, a faint tremor under her poise. Yes, Elena said simply. It would mean I existed. Her words landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples moving outward until they touched every face in the room. Victor pushed back his chair. Enough. His tone was final, the kind that closed boardroom arguments and silenced opposition. But this was not a boardroom, and Elena was not his subordinate. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, thick with documents. Without a word, she placed it on the table beside the envelope. The seal on the will was visible, even from a distance, and several guests recognized it instantly. I didn't come here with accusations, she said. I came with proof, your signature, your handwriting, your promises. Victor's eyes locked on the folder. For the first time, he seemed smaller not in stature, but in certainty. The guests began to murmur again, but Elena no longer cared who watched. Her life had been spent in the shadow of this man's absence, her identity a jigsaw puzzle missing its central piece. Now, piece by piece, she was laying it before him. This doesn't have to be ugly, she continued, but it has to be honest. I am not going away, not tonight, not ever again. Margaret's lips curved into a cold smile. And if we don't acknowledge you, what then? Elena held her gaze. Then the world will. I've made sure of it. For a moment, no one moved. The chandelier above them glimmered, scattering its light like fragments of something long shattered. In the silence, Elena could feel the balance shifting. Not fully, not yet, but enough that they knew she could not be dismissed with a wave of the hand. Victor finally sat down again, his fingers steepled in front of him. You've made your point, he said. Now leave. She shook her head. Not until you say it? Say what? He asked, though they both knew the answer. That I am your daughter. The words lingered in the air, sharp and undeniable. Some looked at Victor with expectation, others with pity. He said nothing. So Elena leaned forward, her voice no louder than before, but carrying to every corner of the room. Silence is an answer, too. And with that, she turned, walking back toward the glass door she had entered. But she did not feel like she was leaving. She felt like she had arrived. Elena didn't rush as she crossed the marble floor, her steps echoing softly in the cavernous hall. She could feel eyes piercing into her back, some heavy with judgment, others with curiosity. It didn't matter. The weight she carried was no longer the burden of secrecy. It was the solid weight of truth, and she would not set it down. At the doors, a young waiter stepped aside to let her pass. His gaze lingered, not out of recognition, but out of something else, a silent respect for someone who had just walked into the lion's den without flinching. But before her hand touched the brass handle, she heard Victor's voice behind her. Wait. It was not a command. It was not even loud, but it stopped her as surely as if the whole room had gone still again. She turned. Victor stood where she had left him, the envelope and the folder beside his untouched champagne glass. His expression was unreadable, but there was a new weight in his stance, a shift from the unshakable patriarch to a man who for once could not fully control the story. Elena, he began, pausing as though the name itself cost him something. If what you claim is true, it isn't a claim, she cut in, her voice calm but firm. It's a fact. You know it. And so did my mother. A muscle tightened in his jaw. Then you also know the damage this would cause. She stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the marble. The only damage here is the years you took from me. The years you pretended I didn't exist. Murmurs swelled again. The family name was currency in this city, and the possibility of a hidden heir was enough to devalue it overnight. But Elena wasn't here for their wealth. She was here to reclaim something that money could never buy back. Victor looked past her toward the crowd, his eyes moving from one familiar face to another friend's, all eyes, business partners, some of whom had shared decades of his life. He saw it in their expressions, the question he could not erase now that it had been spoken aloud. Margaret broke the silence. "Victor, you don't have to entertain this." "Enough, Margaret," he said, his tone sharp enough to still her. For a heartbeat, the hall seemed smaller, more intimate, as though the crowd faded and there were only the two of them. "What do you want?" he asked again, softer this time. "I told you," she said, "the truth, publicly." His gaze hardened. "And if I give you that?" She held her breath for a moment before answering. "Then you give me the piece of myself you took away. I don't need your name, your money, or your charity. I just need you to stop pretending I'm not yours." The simplicity of her request was almost disarming. She was not a blackmailer, not a beggar, not an opportunist. She was a daughter, asking for acknowledgement. Victor exhaled slowly, his eyes lowering to the folder on the table. The will, the letters, the photograph, they were an unshakable record of a truth he had buried. Finally, he said, "You'll have your truth. But not here." She studied him for a moment, measuring the offer, weighing it against the risk of walking away without the acknowledgement she had fought for. "No," she said. "Here, tonight." Gasps rippled through the room again. This was the moment, the point, where she could yield and accept a private settlement, or she could force the doors of this glittering fortress open for all to see inside. Victor's wife rose, her silver bracelets catching the light. "Victor," but he raised a hand to silence her. His eyes locked with Elena's, and for the first time there was no calculation in them, only inevitability. He stood, lifting the photograph from the envelope. The image looked small in his hand, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid for 27 years. He turned to the room. "This is my daughter." The words were not loud, but they did not need to be. They cut through the murmurs, through the decades of silence, and lodged themselves in the air where no one could take them back. Elena felt the tension in her chest ease not completely, but enough to let her breathe without the familiar tightness. She had not imagined this moment with applause or tears. She had only imagined it as real, and now it was. Victor set the photograph back on the table and looked at her. "We will talk, privately." She nodded. For tonight, this was enough. The truth had been spoken where it mattered most, in the space where she had once been invisible. As she turned once more to leave, she realized that no one was looking at Victor anymore. Every gaze followed her instead, and this time she didn't feel out of place. Outside, the night air felt colder than she expected, crisp enough to sting her lungs. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but here, in the shadow of the grand estate, everything felt muted, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Elena stepped down from the marble stairs slowly, her heels clicking against the stone until the sound dissolved into the gravel of the driveway. She didn't look back, not yet. The truth was behind her now, but so was the man who had spoken it aloud for the first time in her life. She reached the edge of the courtyard, where the valet station glowed under warm light. The young attendant glanced up at her, recognition flickering in his eyes. He had been there earlier, holding open the door as she walked in, just another nameless guest among the glittering crowd. But now there was something in his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement, a trace of reverence. "Miss Rivera," he said softly, as though testing the sound of her name in a new way. She smiled faintly. "Just Elena." As he turned to fetch the car she had borrowed from a friend, she caught a reflection in the glass of the entrance doors. Victor stood there, just beyond the threshold, watching her. His figure was outlined by the golden light inside, but his face was unreadable. It struck her that this was the first time she had seen him look unsure in public. The valet returned with the old sedan, its paint dull against the parade of black luxury cars lined along the drive. Elena took the keys, thanking him, but didn't open the door immediately. Instead, she glanced once more toward the house. Victor had not moved. For a moment, she considered walking back, but she knew the danger in that impulse. If she returned tonight, it would be on his terms, in his space, under his control. The truth was out, but the battle over what came next had only begun. She slid into the driver's seat, the leather worn smooth by years of other hands. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, and for a long moment, she simply sat there, feeling the tremor in her own body. It wasn't fear. It was release. As she started the engine, the hum of it felt grounding. She pulled away slowly, the estate receding behind her until it was swallowed by the dark. The drive back into the city was quiet. Her phone buzzed once, then again messages from friends who had heard whispers already. The elite had their own invisible network, and news traveled through it faster than light. She didn't answer. Not yet. Halfway across the bridge, the view opened to the river below, a black ribbon glinting with faint light. She rolled down the window and let the wind in. The cool rush against her skin reminded her of nights when she was younger, when she would walk to the pier just to feel the air and imagine places she had never been. She thought of her mother, then how she used to sit by the kitchen window, staring at the street as though expecting someone. Elena had been too young to understand back then, too focused on school and the constant stretch of money. But now she realized her mother had been waiting for a man who never came. When Elena pulled into the narrow street where she lived, the contrast from the Beaumont estate was stark. Faded paint on brick walls, flickering street lamps, the quiet sound of someone's television drifting from an open window. She parked and sat for a moment before going inside. The apartment was small, but warm. She left the lights off, choosing instead to let the moon spill its silver across the floor. On the kitchen table lay the envelope she had carried for years before finally placing it in front of Victor. The will had been in her possession for 6 months, obtained after a long and meticulous search through records that weren't meant to be found. The letters yellowed, with ink that had bled slightly over time, were even older. And the photograph. She touched it gently now, tracing the faint crease along the corner. In it, her mother stood beside Victor, both of them impossibly young, the city skyline blurred behind them. There was no mistaking the way he looked at her, not like a business partner, not like a friend. Elena exhaled slowly. Tonight had not been about revenge. It had been about removing the shadow from her name, about speaking herself into a story she had been written out of. But she knew the Beaumont family. They would not let this rest. Tomorrow would bring new storms, denials, strategies, attempts to reshape the truth into something that cost them less. She closed her eyes for a moment and let herself rest in the rare quiet. She had stepped into their world tonight, not as an intruder, but as someone with a rightful claim. And though the fight ahead would be long, the foundation had shifted. For the first time, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. The morning came muted, as if the city itself was reluctant to stir. Elena awoke before the alarm, her body restless, mind already turning over the night's events. For a long time she stayed in bed, listening to the low hum of traffic beyond the thin walls, the soft creak of pipes in the building, the ordinary sounds that anchored her to the life she had always known. When she finally rose, the kitchen table was exactly as she had left it, papers spread like a fragile constellation. The photograph, the letters, the will. They seemed smaller in the morning light, less like weapons and more like relics, the quiet witnesses of a truth she had carried too long. Her phone was full of messages, friends, co-workers, even numbers she didn't recognize. Most were variations of, "Is it true?" or "I saw what happened." Some were colder. "You should be careful." She didn't reply to any of them. Instead, She brewed coffee, the rich scent filling the air, and sat at the table with her cup. She traced the curve of the porcelain between her hands and thought about the moment Victor had spoken. The words had been almost gentle, yet they had landed with the weight of a hammer. "This is my daughter." It had been enough, for now. By mid-morning, she decided to leave the apartment. The air outside was cool but clear, the kind of day that might have been beautiful under other circumstances. She walked without hurry, letting the rhythm of her steps settle her mind. At the corner newsstand, the day's headlines were already on display. The Beaumont name was printed in bold, though the words beneath were still cautious phrases like alleged heir and unconfirmed claims. She knew the machine well, the slow dance between rumor and confirmation, the hunger for spectacle without the responsibility of truth. She bought no papers. As she continued toward the market, she caught a glimpse of herself in a shop window. Not the girl who had walked into the party last night, shoulders squared against invisibility. Something in her posture had changed. She didn't look taller, exactly, but she seemed to take up more space. By noon, the call came, a private number. She let it ring twice before answering. "Elena," Victor's voice said, measured, deliberate. "We need to talk." "I thought we already did. This isn't a conversation for the phone. My driver can be there in an hour." She almost refused on instinct, the part of her that bristled at his tendency to summon rather than invite. But she also knew the balance had shifted now. She could walk into any room he called her to, and it would be on her terms, even if he didn't realize it yet. "1 hour," she said, and hung up. The car was sleek and silent, the interior smelling faintly of leather and something sharper cedar, maybe. The driver spoke little, glancing at her only once in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. When they arrived, it wasn't the estate. Instead, the car pulled into the drive of a smaller, older building near the edge of the city, a property that looked more like a private retreat than a residence. Victor was already waiting outside, dressed not in the black suit from last night, but in a dark sweater and coat. The absence of formality made him seem almost ordinary, though the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. "Elena," he greeted, his voice low. "Come inside." The interior was warm, lined with bookshelves and heavy curtains that muted the light. It felt like a place where secrets were kept, not shared. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing until he took a chair across from her. "You made quite an impact last night," he began. "That was the point." He studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You could have come to me privately." "I did," she said, "years ago. Through letters. Through lawyers who never got past your gatekeepers. You ignored me." His gaze didn't falter, but something shifted in his expression. Perhaps recognition, perhaps the faintest hint of regret. "You have to understand," he said slowly. "My world operates on perception, appearances, timing." She almost laughed at the understatement. "Your world is built on control." He didn't deny it. "And now you've changed the equation. Publicly. That's because you never would have acknowledged me otherwise." They were silent for a moment, the air thick between them. Then Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm willing to formalize things," he said. "Your place in the family, the estate. I don't want the estate." "Then what?" She looked at him steadily. "The truth. Not a whispered admission in some closed room. Not a concession wrapped in legal language. I want my name in your story where it belongs. I want you to stop hiding me like a mistake." His jaw tightened, but she saw the flicker in his eyes. He knew he couldn't undo what had been said in that ballroom. The only choice left was whether he would meet the truth with dignity or try to smother it again. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "Don't take too long," she replied. "The world is already asking questions." When she left the building, the air felt different, not lighter, but sharper, as though the lines between them had been drawn more clearly. The car door closed behind her with a quiet click, and as the city streets slid past, she realized something. She was no longer chasing his acknowledgement. She already had it. The rest was about ensuring it could never be taken back. The following days unfolded like a slow unmasking. What had begun as murmurs in gilded rooms spread outward through columns in society pages, through clipped radio commentary, through the relentless hum of the online news cycle. Photos emerged. The blurred image from the party, her face turned toward Victor as he spoke. A scanned copy of one letter from the old correspondence, though the full content remained sealed away. And inevitably, speculation from those who prided themselves on knowing everything that mattered about the Beaumonts. Some of the coverage was almost polite, dressed in the neutral language of developments and possibilities. But other corners of the press carried sharper edges. Was Elena a threat to the family's stability? A scandal manufactured to weaken Victor's influence? She read none of it directly, but fragments still found her: a neighbor's remark at the grocery store, an overheard conversation on the bus. Strangers looked at her longer now, not with hostility, but with the unsettled curiosity of people trying to fit a new name into an old hierarchy. On the third morning, she received an envelope slid under her apartment door. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the Beaumont family crest, pressed deep into thick parchment. Family Council. Friday, 7 p.m. attendance expected. There was no signature. The date was only 2 days away. She stared at the paper for a long time. This was not an invitation. It was a summons. The kind of message that assumed the recipient would arrive without question. When Friday came, the same black car appeared at her building. She stepped inside without a word. The driver didn't glance back as they left the narrow streets behind for the long, winding approach to the main estate. The Beaumont residence glowed in the night like a citadel, every window alight. The air was sharp with winter, the gravel crunching underfoot as she crossed to the entrance. Inside, the family was already gathered in a long dining hall that felt older than anything in the city. Portraits lined the walls, faces of men and women who stared down with the same eyes she saw in the mirror now, whether they wanted to admit it or not. At the far end of the table sat Victor, his hands folded on the polished wood. Beside him, an older woman whose presence radiated both elegance and quiet menace, Margaret Beaumont, his sister. Elena knew her by reputation sharp-tongued, fiercely protective of the family's reputation, and utterly unsentimental. To either side of the table, other relatives sat in silence, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain. Victor gestured for her to sit at the opposite end. The space between them felt like a mile. Margaret was the first to speak. "We are here," she began, "because certain revelations have been made public, and because my brother has chosen to acknowledge them." Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a warning. Victor's eyes flicked toward Elena. "This is my daughter," he said again, more firmly than he had in the ballroom. "And she has the right to be recognized as such." One of the men halfway down the table, a cousin, perhaps, leaned forward. "Recognized how? In name? In inheritance? Do you expect us to dilute the legacy because of truth?" Elena's voice cut cleanly across his. "That legacy is already diluted if it's built on omission." The room shifted, some faces hardening, others softening slightly. Margaret's gaze did not leave her. "We have records. We have a structure that governs how these matters are handled." "And I have proof," Elena replied, laying the folder on the table. She didn't push it forward yet, letting the moment stretch. "Proof that predates any of your structures. My mother's letters. The will your lawyers never wanted to acknowledge. Photographs, dates, signatures." The cousin scoffed. "Anyone can forge. They've been authenticated," she said. by an independent examiner. The results are documented and notarized. Victor leaned back slightly, as though this was the first he was hearing of the authentication. But he didn't challenge it. The conversation turned into a slow, deliberate unspooling of the evidence. Elena placed each item on the table in silence before speaking, allowing the weight of each artifact to settle. The photograph of her mother and Victor, their youth caught in the warmth of a late summer evening. The letter in Victor's own handwriting, signed in ink that had faded but not vanished. The clause in the will naming Elena, issue of my blood, as a beneficiary. It was all there, undeniable. The silence after she finished was long enough to feel like a verdict. Margaret's hands, perfectly still on the table, finally moved to adjust the papers before her. "We will need time," she said. "No," Victor interrupted, his voice calm but final. "The time for waiting ended the moment I spoke her name." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Around the table, no one else spoke. Elena gathered her papers slowly, the leather folder snapping shut with a quiet finality. She stood, meeting Victor's gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Recognition isn't yours to grant anymore," she said. "It's already mine." And with that, she turned and walked the length of the table, the portraits watching her leave. Outside, the night air was colder than before, but she welcomed it. Somewhere behind her, the balance of power had shifted again, not loudly, not with spectacle, but in the quiet, irreversible way that happens when denial is no longer possible. She didn't need their blessing. She had the truth, and the truth was enough. The following weeks unfolded with a strange stillness, the kind that is not peace, but a pause like the air before a storm that decides never to break. The Bowmans did not issue a public statement. There were no dramatic press conferences, no photo opportunities to smooth the story into something palatable. Instead, they seemed to retreat into their own high walls, where decisions were made in rooms Elena would never enter, at tables where her chair still sat empty. Yet the silence worked in her favor. Without the family's version of events to replace her own, the truth she had revealed at the gala lingered, repeated in quiet corners of conversation until it became part of the accepted story. She was no longer an intruder in that world. She was a name that could not be erased without drawing attention to the erasure. On a rainy morning in late March, a letter arrived, not slid under her door this time, but sent through the post, the envelope heavy and cream-colored. The handwriting was precise, deliberate. Inside was a single sheet, again bearing the Beaumont crest, but this time signed at the bottom. "Elena, enclosed you will find a copy of the revised trust documents. They reflect your rightful place among the heirs, as per Victor's instructions. I expect you will treat this with the gravity it warrants." Margaret, the tone was cold, but the meaning was clear. The matter was no longer in dispute. Beneath the letter, the legal documents lay in tidy order, her name printed alongside the others. The sight of it stirred something deep in her, not triumph exactly, but a quiet settling of the self. Her existence had moved from the margins to the record. She didn't tell anyone immediately. Not her friends, not her neighbors, not even the few acquaintances in the city who had asked her about the Beaumonts in whispers. This was not a victory to parade. It was, instead, a restoration something private, like a wound finally closing. A week later, she did make one visit. Not to the estate, but to the cemetery on the edge of town, where her mother's grave sat beneath a maple tree just beginning to bud for spring. She brought no flowers, her mother had never cared for them, but instead placed the folder of documents at the base of the headstone, weighing it down with a smooth stone from the path. "I told you," she murmured, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "I told you I'd make them say it out loud." She stayed there a long while, the rain easing into mist, the air smelling faintly of earth and new leaves. 2 months later, she received a call from Victor. His voice on the phone was softer than she remembered, stripped of the commanding weight he carried in public. "I'd like to see you," he said. "No council, no family. Just us." They met in a small cafe on the waterfront, the kind of place no one from the Beaumont circle would think to enter. He arrived in a dark coat, his hair touched with more silver than she remembered. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, neither speaking. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, different from the ones she had shown at the gala. In it, her mother was holding a newborn, the edges of her smile both exhausted and luminous. "She sent this to me the day you were born," he said quietly. "I kept it all these years. I should have done more than that." Elena studied the photo and looked up at him. "Why didn't you?" He exhaled, his gaze fixed on the table. "Cowardice. And the illusion that protecting my position was the same as protecting the people I cared about." She let the words sit between them. There was no apology large enough to fill the years, no explanation that could rewrite the past. But there was something in his face, now a humility she hadn't seen before, and perhaps never would have if the truth had stayed buried. They spoke for an hour, not about the trust or the inheritance, but about her mother, her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she could silence a room without raising her voice. When they parted, Victor didn't ask for forgiveness, and she didn't offer it. Some things didn't need to be closed. They only needed to be seen clearly. In the months that followed, Elena's life didn't change in the way people might have imagined. She didn't move into a penthouse or trade her worn sedan for something sleek and black. She stayed in her apartment, kept her work, walked the same streets. The difference was quieter, but deeper. When people looked at her now, they didn't see a shadow of uncertainty. They saw someone who knew exactly who she was, and whose name could no longer be spoken as an afterthought. The Beaumonts remained what they had always been: powerful, guarded, bound together by ties both visible and hidden. But within that structure, there was now a place for her, carved not by their generosity, but by her insistence. On a late summer evening, she found herself standing at the edge of the pier, watching the water shift in the fading light. The air smelled faintly of salt and rain. Somewhere in the distance, the city hummed, indifferent and endless. She thought of her mother, of the years she had carried a truth no one wanted to hear, and of the moment in the ballroom when silence had finally broken. The wind moved through her hair, and she let it. There had been no vengeance, no spectacle of punishment, only the slow, deliberate act of setting the record straight. And in that, there was a kind of justice far stronger than anything the Beaumonts could give or take away. She turned from the water, the evening folding itself around her. Somewhere behind her, the city lights began to bloom against the dark, and she walked toward them, not as an intruder, not as an outsider, but as herself. And this time, she would not be forgotten.